recording a message to Stanford Says No to War with an apology for not appearing by Skype video, which was the original plan, and not submitting a video statement, which was Plan B, but submitting this audio if possible as a third alternative. The reason being simply that there is no fast internet in Afghanistan unless you work for the U.S. military, which I do not think is a reason for joining the U.S. military, which does not have a respectable, a humanitarian, a decent, or a legal mission here in Afghanistan, which has not only not provided the people with fast internet, has not provided them with clean air or water or security or a life that can be sustained. The International Committee of the Red Cross recently declared that this situation is simply untenable, that we are headed towards epidemics and disaster in this poorest place on the planet. And in fact, the U.S. military here is spending a fortune on warfare and missiles and bases, and next to nothing on anything else other than propaganda. And things have been going from bad to worse in terms of health, in terms of security, in terms of the environment and the economy. Everything is worse this year compared to last year, not despite, but because of the escalation of the U.S. occupation, or the so-called NATO occupation of Afghanistan. The U.S., of course, is the bulk of NATO. The history of this place for the United States has to start back in 1979, when our National Security Advisor, then Zbigniew Brzezinski, takes credit for having begun arming the Mujahideen in an effort to provoke the Soviet Union to attack Afghanistan, and asked later whether he regretted the horrors of the Civil War, the horrors of the terrorism and the Taliban that resulted from that, and he dismissed all of that as unimportant in comparison with what he thinks he contributed to the downfall of the Soviet Union. So the idea that American so-called servicemen and women, that is soldiers and in as great numbers mercenaries in this country, are doing something worthwhile for humanity is just repulsive. It's along the lines of the idea that we are engaged in a humanitarian mission now in Libya, a mission for which our nation garnered the support of Saudi Arabia and Muslim nations in the Middle East by green-lighting Saudi Arabia to go into Bahrain and slaughter civilians. Meanwhile, we are ignoring greater humanitarian disasters in other places where we don't have strategic, political, and resource interests in going in and overthrowing a government. If you take part in one of these wars, which in most cases are better described as either bombardments, invasions, or occupations, you will, as likely as not, be asked to commit horrible, horrible atrocities. It has become almost routine now to hear of U.S. soldiers and helicopters in Afghanistan shooting children, kicking in doors and shooting women and children, killing civilians for sport and posing in photographs with the corpses. And if you are not asked to commit such an atrocity, you are nonetheless taking part in a mission that is in its entirety an atrocity. When you are taking part in something that cannot possibly succeed, cannot possibly result in a better place, that is killing and wounding and traumatizing and devastating people for no good purpose, but for making a country worse and driving a country into a cycle of violence as people are brought up with knowledge of nothing else but violence. You are part of something that is immoral and atrocious as well as illegal. It's not something to be proud of because there's bravery involved, or because there's solidarity and camaraderie and loyalty and self-sacrifice involved. Of course, those are all noble qualities. But jumping out a window is brave. It's not heroic. It's not bravery toward a good purpose. And taking part in an illegal, disastrous war, when war has become something we cannot survive as a species, environmentally, economically, or in terms of weapons proliferation and the danger of complete annihilation, then you are not doing something heroic, no matter how much bravery might be involved. Excuse me. By the way, the air here is almost impossible to breathe. If you join the U.S. military, you are joining something that is very, very different from what it was 100 years ago, even 50 years ago. You're joining an organization that has perfected the art of not training, but conditioning its members to unthinkingly respond in crisis situations by killing. And increasingly, members of this military are unable afterwards to live with what they have done. And so if you want to go into something with that understanding, you should do so with your eyes wide open, knowing that you are going to be conditioned to your deepest soul to become the worst possible thing, ethically, morally, for any society, for any time or place other than a battlefield. And you are going to have to come back out of that battlefield and live with the rest of us. And you're going to have a very, very difficult time doing it. I should mention my book, which I think you've got a supply of there. It's called War is a Lie. And I wrote this book because there was this misunderstanding in our country that the Iraq War was somehow different from other wars, that this was a war based on lies, and other wars were not based on lies. And in fact, I can't find a war anywhere that hasn't been based on lies. Lies to get it started, lies to keep it going, lies about what it was after the fact, lies about the military machine needed to permit future wars of the same sort. And the lies are not infinite in variety. There are a number of types and patterns that can be predicted and expected and pointed out the minute you hear them without waiting decades for something to be exposed. There are always lies about the incredible evil demon against whom we must fight the war. There are always lies about how a war is defensive, no matter we're going halfway around the world to an unarmed, impoverished nation to fight our war. It's defensive. There are lies, especially in recent decades, about war as a humanitarian act of generosity, and so forth. And so in the book, I try to create a sort of war preparedness in the sense of being prepared to spot the lies, so that you could hear the stories about the need to go into Libya and understand that the motivation had nothing to do with protecting human life, and that a rebellion of 1,000 people led by a CIA puppet shipped in from Virginia was not a grassroots people's movement likely to result in a stable, peaceful, democratic, and just society, but was another possibly endless bloody war for the opposite of a noble purpose. So the imperial homeland, as they call it, there are lies told in the countries where the wars are fought. Because of war, of course, wars are no longer fought on so-called battlefields. They're not out in a rural area with trench lines of soldiers in different colored uniforms going up against each other and then going home to their wife and kids. Wars are fought in people's houses and towns and villages and cities, just not ours, in the other people's. And wars have to be told there too. So the people of Afghanistan are being told by U.S. media that if the Karzai government falls, the Taliban will take power immediately, which is possible, but is a very dubious claim. It's certainly there's certainly nothing certain or even probable about it, and so I want to read to you a column that I just wrote for a newspaper and just submitted. It hasn't been published yet, and I hope it will be. But this is something I just wrote about my experience here this week in Afghanistan. I hope it's helpful to you. This is called "In Afghanistan, the Young Will Lead." I've been speaking with everyone I can in this filthy capital of a forgotten but worsening war, asking them how their country can find peace. I've asked members of parliament, newspaper editors, filmmakers, photographers, some very smart people. But not until I asked teenagers did I get a very smart answer. I've been told, falsely, that this society has experienced an unbroken tradition of vengeful tribal violence for centuries which cannot be overcome. I've been told by old people that even young people cannot unite across ethnic lines here, dooming them to powerlessness. I've heard that the same people who confidently expect to overthrow President Karzai the day after NATO leaves are utterly powerless to prevent a Taliban takeover, regardless of the fact that Karzai enjoys more support than the Taliban. The youth and women are unable to take action, I'm told, by old men, because the government doesn't want them to. And of course I've been informed, this is a minority view, that the U.S. military is here purely out of the goodness of its heart. A young man of 15, Abdullah, lost his father, killed by the Taliban. Abdullah recently explained his desire for peace and nonviolence from all sides to a defender of the U.S. NATO occupation. The icy response was that the Taliban ought to have killed him as well. This cheerful, energetic youngster who suffered a powerful loss has apparently overcome it, was told that he was too young to know real suffering. But the younger man was the wiser in this conversation, responding without anger or hatred, and opposing the maintenance of a vicious cycle of violent force and vengeance. Abdullah has joined Afghan Youth Peace Volunteers, a completely new kind of organization in Afghanistan. They recently held a march for peace in Kabul, which the media covered as a new phenomenon. They've included girls in their membership. They've included boys and girls from the Hazara and Tajik ethnic groups. They've handmade and shipped presents to Pashtun youth, along with a message of peace and love, something that Pashtun youth leaders say they will never forget. The Afghan Youth Peace Volunteers have issued statements in support of peace and delivered them to top U.S. and UN officials. They've found allies and members around the country and abroad. And above all, they have educated and opened minds. On a recent morning, 4 members of Afghan Youth Peace Volunteers spoke to a college class in Kabul. The professor with the loudest voice argued that the United States and NATO were here for the good of all people. Faiz, age 20, was among those who spoke up in response. Speaking to elders is not part of the tradition these young men have grown up in, but they believe it has become necessary. Some eyes were opened, and about half the class seemed to believe that peace might be possible. What is it with old people? I asked some Afghan Youth Peace Volunteer young men. The experience of the Taliban has crippled them with fear, said Abdullah. Some 60% of Afghans suffer PTSD or other serious psychological damage. Faiz said that in fact the government works very hard to make people believe they are powerless. Ali said that as soon as people are able to all stand together, it will be that easy. Gulenay added that extreme distrust must first be overcome through relationships and friendships. Last year, 2 of these young men went to the U.S. Embassy bearing an invitation letter from the Fellowship on Reconciliation. The women on television aired military propaganda interspersed in a movie about women in bikinis. There were a lot of doors and guards to go past before speaking with someone, and the officials were rude and insulting. Before they could obtain visas, the young men had to explain what message they had for the American people. Faiz replied the truth, and Abdullah replied the voice of peace. This resulted in their questioner laughing and making fun of them. Their visas were rejected. That would have been the last thing Washington, D.C. wanted to import, I guess. Peace and truth. But Afghanistan may be able to grow into it. 68% of the population is under 25 years old, according to the government. A lot of that 68% sees violence as old-fashioned and out of date. And that's the end of the column. And the moral of the story, I suppose, it is that if you want to be part of something challenging and worthwhile and self-sacrificing and requiring courage and action, it can be something positive. It can be working for peace. It can be working for environmental protection. It can be working for cleaning up the disasters that have been left by destruction such as war. The people working here for the Red Cross are extremely brave and find their work extremely gratifying. So I think there should be no question in your mind that choosing the military as your own career is the worst possible choice and something you should have a very difficult time morally living with. But I think that you should also not fall into the trap of fairness and balance and the need to allow the sellers of the very worst thing humanity has ever invented, of the biggest crime we still engage in at a massive scale. War, of course, was banned in the Kellogg-Briand Pact in 1928, in the UN Charter in 1945. It is, with limited exceptions, a crime. To allow the promotion of this crime and the recruitment of participants in this, the very worst crime ever created, on your campus, I think would be disgraceful. We don't talk about just rapes. We don't talk about good slavery. There are some things that we have put beyond the pale that we understand cannot be acceptable tools of public policy or individual conduct. And war is the very worst thing. I think it's important to understand as well that under Article 6 of the U.S. Constitution, treaties to which our nation is party are the supreme law of the land. And that since 1976, the United States has been party to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Article 20 of which states, quote, "Any propaganda for war shall be prohibited by law," end quote. ROTC recruitment is nothing other than propaganda for war and training to make war look acceptable and civilized and survivable. I think that you owe it to yourselves and to the rest of the country and the college community that can benefit from your example to say no, not just to war, but to the machinery that doesn't years ago this year, the pressure that makes the wars happen. Please, for God's sake, say no.
A powerful message, I think, for me anyway. I found it quite powerful, and we've still got 15, 20 minutes if anyone wants to ask more questions. Or if, I don't know if you guys want to make a comment on what David Swanson said, or...
He was getting really to the point, I thought, where he was wanting to ban ROTC from campuses. He said, hey, ROTC is a crime. And you heard his argument, and here it is. The argument, and think of the fact that the argument we're talking about is ROTC. What is the war about? You know, it changes every month. Every year it's the reasons for why we're at war changes. We should be discussing larger issues instead of this almost silly little local provincial thing. That's happening on a national scale, but we don't. We ought to demand that we be part of the bigger picture, discuss why we're fighting these peasants in Afghanistan, why we're fighting the people of Yemen, why we can't support the people of Bahrain, why we can't come out, why we didn't come out at the beginning for the people of Egypt. That's where the real issues are.
Thanks. Roy, did you have a comment?
When you're at Stanford, it's like living in a bubble, and the outside world is very far away. But in fact, it's not. And it's amazing that you guys are here, because the vast majority aren't, right? And so you guys are the special ones who, for some real reason, have actually decided to make a little effort or have a little bit beyond yourselves. And so I think I congratulate you for just being here. And being a peace activist is a long-term kind of project, because we're not going to make a lot of changes. But just because it's not easy doesn't mean it's not worth doing it. And if I had to do it all again, I would go into the belly of the beast again. Why would I do now? Because somebody's got to do it.
I'm always reminded, and he once again reminded me of what Ernest Hemingway once said. Never doubt that no matter how seemingly necessary or just a war is, it is not a crime. Ask the infantry, ask the dead. And now I guess you could add a whole bunch of civilians to because he was, he was an ambulance driver in World War I, so that war didn't have as much of the stuff we call collateral damage, but that seems to be the main target of wars these days, is the collateral damage, not the soldiers.
Yeah, I think one of the points David Swanson makes in the book is that the proportion of soldiers killed to civilians killed has been dropping as, like you said, more wars are being fought in cities now, not on battlefields. It's not the Civil War where both sides are lined up with their muskets and charge at each other or anything like that. It's urban warfare, which and the combatants can run into an alley, or maybe they're indistinguishable from the civilians or whatever. But whatever the cause might be, the ratio has dramatically changed over the past 10, 20, 30 years.
Well, a few years ago, you folks are probably too young to remember it, the military wanted to have exercises in Oakland and Alameda, and they called it urban guerrilla warfare. And they were actually going to take Marines and soldiers into the streets of Oakland and Alameda. They were going to land them at the old Alameda carrier base. They would come through town just like, just like they were invading. And Veterans for Peace took a leadership role in opposing that. But we didn't just see it as training for somewhere else. I mean, why would they pick Oakland? Right. To add the fear of the military to a community that's largely people of color, you know. So once again, that's one thing we always forget. They didn't do the kind of stuff even in Kosovo or places like that where a lot of bad things were done, but that's because most of them people are white. And did anybody in our governments raise one finger to defend the people who were being slaughtered with machetes and clubs in Burundi or what's the other one? Rwanda. No, they sent some UN forces to get the white folks out. I saw the movie.
You could even say the same thing that's happening right now in Ivory Coast, right?
Oh yeah, Ivory Coast. You can just make a list of them.
Right.
And if there are dictators like that guy in Tajikistan, Mohammed, what's his name?
Yeah. there's a
Anyway,
few of those around there.
They, you know, he's our boy, and they got some oil there, and they're trying to build a pipe. They want to build a pipeline through Afghanistan. So you know, it's I may not be too bright, but I think it was in some movie. Somebody said, "Show me the money. Show me the money," and you know what they're doing. But one thing to remember about Afghanistan was when the British were trying to reestablish control of Afghanistan, the Afghanis captured a whole British division. How many people is that, Joe? A division. That's a lot of troops.
That's short of 20,000.
And they executed all of them except one and sent him back to the British headquarters with safe passage, so they would, you know, anytime you go in the hills and mess around with a bunch of hillbillies, and I'm a hillbilly from North Alabama, you ain't gonna win. You know, Mexico, they went in them hills down there in Chiapas, and the Mexicans haven't never won that. Every time you go in the hills, that's with the hillbillies. The first people to take up arms against the U.S. government was the North Carolina regulators, and they were pissed off because the government was trying to regulate the whiskey up in the hills. I know, because I'm from North Carolina. I come from a long bunch of drunks and ne'er-do-wells.
Any other questions for Joe and Roy?
Don't forget to sign an orange card and leave it here. Don't forget to take any of that literature you want. You can take one copy for yourself and 20 copies for somebody else. Take whatever you want.
No worries. Well,
Because I'm too lazy to carry it back down the car.
if there's no more questions, we might thank Roy, Joe and George for coming. And the website is no.ro.tc of the campaign. There's another event tomorrow night at 6:30 at Wilbur Meeting Room. David Harris will be speaking, former ASSU president and New York Times reporter. And then on Thursday night, we're showing a film at El Centro Chicano at 7 p.m.
Also a man who did time in jail for not...
David Harris,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, that's
Yes.
right. He did.
Oh, that's right.
He
Las Tunas federal prison.
indeed. Thank you for coming.
Okay, thanks for having us.